She noticed a strange chain buried in the sand and decided to find out where it led. But when the experts reached the other end, everyone turned pale. Subscribe to the channel and write in the comments what country you're watching from. The wind on Adler Island had a cruel way of making itself known, howling through the cracked boards of the small rental house that Maria Hall now called home. It slipped beneath the doorframe and wormed its way through every gap, testing her resolve as though nature itself questioned whether she truly belonged in this desolate corner of Alaska. But Maria had endured far worse storms in her life than icy wind or the wild roars of the ocean. This place, remote and unforgiving as it was, represented a chance at survival, a fragile hope. And hope was something she had not allowed herself for a long time. Maria had once believed her life would be simple but warm. She grew up knowing how easily stability could vanish, how fragile comfort actually was. Her parents were distant figures, always too preoccupied with their own disappointments to notice hers. The house she grew up in was noisy with arguments and silent at the moments that mattered. She learned early to cook for herself, to take care of her clothes, to mend what was broken rather than ask anyone for help. Perhaps that was why, when she first met Michael at a modest gathering of friends, his calmness had drawn her in. His laughter had been genuine, not cutting or mocking. When he held her hand, there was certainty and promise in that touch. With him, she tasted a life that felt safe. They married quietly, exchanging vows that were as heartfelt as any extravagant ceremony could have offered. For a time, they believed the world would make space for their happiness. When she discovered she was pregnant, Maria felt the future blossoming inside her. Not only a child, but a new purpose. When their son Ethan was born, tiny and squirming and warm against her chest, she whispered a promise into his soft hair. She would never let the world hurt him the way it had once hurt her. But life had a cruel tendency to break the promises that people held closest. Michael's death came suddenly, leaving Maria with a baby in her arms and a life collapsing around her like a sandcastle swallowed by the tide. The details of his passing, whether illness or accident, were etched into her with too much pain to revisit often. What mattered was that one day he kissed her goodbye before leaving for work, and he never returned. Maria had held herself together through the funeral only for Ethan's sake, refusing to cry in front of him even when her heart shattered. After that day, every dawn felt like a test she barely survived. Bills piled up. Work became scarce. She learned to stretch every dollar and go without so Ethan wouldn't have to. Eventually, it became clear that the city no longer held anything for her except ghosts and debts. Through a local job posting, she heard of a place where rent was cheap and anyone willing to work hard could find something to do. A tiny island, barely a dot on the map. Adler Island. She imagined it would be a temporary stop along the road to something better. But in truth, she had nowhere else to go. The first glimpse of Adler Island had been almost cinematic. Jagged cliffs rising from tumultuous waters. Clusters of houses huddled against the wind like weary travelers seeking shelter. A harbor with more rusted boats than living souls. The island felt isolated from the rest of the world, not only by distance, but by the sheer force of nature surrounding it. People here were carved from tides and storms. Their eyes spoke of endurance, not welcome. Her new home was a weathered cabin near the shore. Walls chipped and tired, the roof patched more times than she could count. But there was enough space for her and Ethan, and the landlord, an old fisherman with sun-scarred skin, offered a price she could actually afford. She thanked him sincerely, and he only nodded, as if kindness was something he didn't want to claim credit for. That gesture told her more about the people here than any introduction could. In the ensuing weeks, Maria built a new rhythm for them. She found part-time work at a supply store near the docks, stacking crates and keeping inventory. It wasn't glamorous, but it was honest. Early mornings were spent collecting what the sea cast onto the beach driftwood, discarded ropes, stray pieces of metal. Mostly junk, but sometimes she found something useful or sellable. Those little discoveries helped buy food and shoes that fit Ethan's growing feet. She did laundry by hand, cooked simple meals, and spent evenings mending clothes by the dim glow of a thrifted lamp. To the locals, Maria was a stranger. They watched her with guarded eyes, especially because she had come alone with a child. Some nodded politely, but few offered conversation. Rumor traveled swiftly here, and being new meant nobody trusted you yet. Maria didn't take it personally. Trust was earned, and she knew patience better than most. Ethan, now 5 years old, adapted faster than she did. He chased seabirds with shrill laughter, collected shells by the shore, asked endless questions about lighthouses and fishing nets. His curiosity became the brightness in Maria's days, the reminder of why they were fighting to stay afloat. When she tucked him into bed each night beneath hand-me-down blankets, she tried to believe that this island, with all its harshness, might grant them a chance at rebuilding. Yet beneath that cautious optimism lay fear. Every time a bill arrived, every time her hours at work shrank or the landlord mentioned repairs, she felt panic curl its way back into her chest. She constantly calculated, rationed, stretched. Having known loss, she feared its return like a storm on the horizon. She often woke in the small hours of the morning, heart pounding, certain that survival was slipping through her fingers like sand. In those moments, she would sit beside Ethan's bed, watching him breathe, reminding herself that for his sake she could not break. Still, the ocean brought a sense of strange comfort. It was wild and relentless, but its constancy soothed her. It reminded her that no matter how fiercely life could lash at someone, the tides always returned, the waves always continued. Maria would walk along the beach before her shift started, inhaling the metallic tang of salt mixed with seaweed. The beach stretched long and stony, decorated with kelp tangled like ancient ropes and driftwood shaped into sculptures by time and tide. One particularly cold morning, when the sky was heavy with overcast gray and the sun a mere suggestion behind thick clouds, Maria set out earlier than usual. The tide had been unusually high the night before, the wind rattling the windows of their house with enough violence that she had barely slept. She suspected the storm may have dragged more debris ashore. If she was lucky, she might find something she could barter with the repairman, who occasionally fixed their heater. She pulled her coat tighter around her and stepped carefully along the damp sand, Ethan still asleep under layers of blankets back home. The rough stones pressed through the soles of her worn boots. The scenery had a strange beauty in the dawn sea mist rising from dark water, seagulls hovering like white shadows against the gloom. Her breath escaped in small, visible clouds. That was when she noticed it, a curve of dark metal protruding from the gravel near the edge of the shore. At first she assumed it was just another rusted scrap, maybe part of an old anchor chain broken long ago. These beaches had their share of relics from fishermen's forgotten equipment or shipwreck remnants that surfaced after storms. But something about this shape drew her closer, with a pull she couldn't explain. Kneeling in the cold sand, she sank her fingers into the wet gravel and brushed away layers of seaweed and pebbles. The object grew larger beneath her hands, revealing not just a single piece of metal, but an enormous chain link, thick as her wrist and pitted with decades of corrosion. It was far heavier than anything she had ever encountered washed ashore. Her heart gave a small, startled jump as she followed the chain's direction, realizing it trailed out toward the sea, disappearing beneath a shifting tide as though tethered to something deep and immovable. For a moment she simply stared, breath caught inside her chest. There was something unsettling about the way the chain remained still while everything around it moved. The sea tugged restlessly, but the massive links did not sway. It felt impossible, yet there it lay, as if the ocean itself feared to disturb whatever was on the other end. Maria straightened slowly, wiping sand from her palms onto her jeans, her gaze locked onto the ridged metal disappearing into the surf. Instinct whispered that she should walk away, pretend she had not seen it. Life on this island had already taught her that knowledge sometimes meant trouble, but another instinct, one sharpened by hardship, urged her to take this seriously. Anything this large could be dangerous. If there was a shipwreck here she had never heard about, what else might be lurking beneath the waves? Reaching into her pocket, she pulled out the phone she had replaced only after the old one completely died. The battered device wasn't much, but the camera worked. She took several photos from different angles, stepping back to capture just how massive the chain appeared against the scale of the beach. The cold wind whipped her hair into her face, but she barely noticed. Her heartbeat thudded louder than the crashing waves. When she turned away, cradling the phone in her hand like evidence, she clung to the idea that she was doing the right thing, not just for herself or Ethan, but for everyone living near this coast. She headed toward town, rehearsing what she might say. She knew exactly how skeptics would see her, just another desperate mother trying to make a story out of nothing. But she would persist. She had learned to fight for every scrap of security her child had. She wouldn't let doubt or dismissal silence her now. The small office of the local maritime authority was rarely busy at this hour. A single middle-aged guard sat behind the counter, flipping casually through paperwork. He looked up when Maria entered, eyebrows lifting faintly in surprise. She explained her discovery with as much clarity as she could, handing over her phone so he might see the photographs himself. As she anticipated, his first reaction was mild skepticism. He shrugged, suggesting it was probably just debris from an old pier or a fishing vessel no one cared about anymore. She didn't blame him. She wouldn't have believed it either without seeing it. But Maria refused to let dismissal deter her. She kept her voice steady, insisting on the scale of what she had found. No pier chain was that massive. Nothing made sense except something extraordinary. She watched as his expression changed, slight uncertainty creeping into his eyes when he zoomed in on a picture. He promised to forward the images to his superiors, though his tone made it clear he didn't expect much to come of it. Maria walked out of the office knowing she might have accomplished nothing at all, but content that she hadn't turned her back on what she saw. If danger lurked beneath those cold waves, someone needed to know. She returned to Ethan with frozen fingers and a mind swirling with what-ifs. But she said nothing to him about the chain. There was no need to place weight on his small shoulders that she could carry alone. That night, as she lay listening to the sea battering the shoreline and the beams of their fragile home groaning under the wind's assault, Maria wondered whether her discovery would change anything. Perhaps the authorities would ignore her, convinced the ocean had coughed up nothing but another piece of nautical junk. Or perhaps the chain was merely the tip of something much larger, a silent relic of the past waiting beneath the surface for someone brave or foolish enough to notice. Maria didn't know which possibility unsettled her more, but as sleep finally dragged her under, one quiet truth echoed through her. The tide had brought something to her feet, and she had the uneasy feeling that the ocean was not finished revealing its secrets. Days passed in quiet anticipation. Maria continued her routine, though her thoughts rarely strayed far from the stretch of beach where the chain lay half buried. Every morning she found herself glancing toward the shore, half expecting to see officials swarming the area or heavy machinery already at work. Yet the beach remained empty, save for gulls picking at kelp and the endless stroking of waves against stone. She told herself not to hope for too much. People like her had learned that the world responded slowly, if at all, to the concerns of those who had nothing to offer in return. Still, the waiting gnawed at her. She checked her phone more often than usual, just in case someone had tried to contact her. Nothing. She considered walking back into the maritime office to insist they follow up, but fear of becoming a nuisance held her back. She didn't want to give them any new excuses to ignore her. On the third morning after her report, she stepped outside with Ethan bundled tightly at her side. The storm had finally passed, leaving a brittle brightness in the air. The sea shimmered silver under the first rays of sunlight, and the clouds retreated toward the horizon like defeated soldiers. As they made their way along the dirt road toward the general store, a low rumble vibrated through the stillness. At first she thought it might be thunder echoing far away, but when she looked toward the port, she saw a sight that made her heart stall. 2 Coast Guard patrol boats cut through the water, their engines churning white trails behind them as they approached the modest dock. They were larger than any craft usually moored there, immaculate and metallic against the weathered wood around them. Uniformed personnel stood aboard the decks, surveying the shoreline with clinical attention. Behind the boats came a barge loaded with equipment, cranes, sealed containers, coils of industrial cable. Workers hurried across the pier to tie down the vessels as they arrived. Ethan tugged at her hand, asking what was happening, but Maria couldn't answer right away. A nervous thrill ran through her. They had come. Someone had taken her seriously after all. She felt a strange mixture of pride and dread that sat uneasily in her stomach. Mother and son stood and watched as more vehicles rolled onto the island, an SUV with emergency lights, a truck carrying diving cylinders, cases of tools and crates with warning labels stark against the metal. The presence of the authorities did not go unnoticed by the townspeople. Doors creaked open as the islanders stepped out to observe. Conversations swelled in low, suspicious murmurs. Anything that disrupted the familiarity of daily life here drew immediate scrutiny. Strangers arriving en masse was unsettling enough. But this felt like the beginning of something none of them had expected. Maria took Ethan by the shoulders and ushered him into the shop. Her shift began like any other, the routine movements grounding her even as her thoughts churned. Customers trickled in, many gossiping loudly about what might be unfolding. She heard guesses ranging from drug smuggling to an environmental disaster, and she kept her silence, neither confirming nor denying any speculation. Her role in all of this remained her secret for now, tucked away where nobody could challenge it. When her workday ended, she picked up Ethan and walked home along the coastal path, and that was when she saw them for the first time with her own eyes. The specialists. A team of divers in thick black suits and heavy boots stood around the section of beach where she had found the chain. They had erected a temporary perimeter with markers driven into the sand. Some knelt to examine the exposed links, while others prepared lines and equipment. A few officials stood by, radios clipped to their belts, talking in urgent, quiet tones. The chain itself had been uncovered further, the storm having swept away some of the gravel that once concealed it. The massive metal links gleamed wet under the sun, ancient rust flaking like scabs. And still, impossibly, it held firm against the pull of the sea. Maria lingered just far enough away not to be noticed, her pulse hammering faster the longer she watched. She didn't dare speak to anyone yet. This was beyond her now. She clutched Ethan's hand, and he sensed her tension, becoming unusually quiet. The sense of danger hummed beneath the surface of the scene, invisible yet unmistakable. By evening, the divers had begun testing the waters. She saw them lower themselves into the churning surf, disappearing beneath the surface with barely a splash. Her imagination followed them downward, picturing the dark world beneath the waves, the pressure building around them as they followed the chain into the abyss. What would they find down there? What story from the past was pulling at the edge of her island life? Back at home while Ethan slept, Maria sat awake staring out through the small kitchen window. Flashing lights from emergency vehicles glowed faintly in the distance. She wondered whether she had set something in motion that she could no longer control. She had wanted to protect the town, but what if she had instead unleashed a threat greater than she could comprehend? The island was so small, so isolated. Any danger lurking beneath those waters would have nowhere to go except toward them. She drifted into an uneasy sleep only when exhaustion claimed her, but the sea haunted her dreams. Endless chains stretching into the blackness. Something large and terrible waiting at the bottom. The next afternoon brought the first official news. Authorities announced that a subsea investigation was underway to examine a possible submerged vessel. The word vessel struck everyone differently. To the fishermen, it hinted at a sunken treasure or lost craft worth salvaging. To the older islanders, whose memories stretched back to tales of wartime vessels navigating the northern Pacific, it awakened unease. But Maria felt the deepest churn of dread. She had seen the chain. She had touched it. Nothing so massive belonged near their fragile shore unless history itself had dragged it there. She walked with Ethan to the beach again, though the area was now cordoned off. A few curious locals gathered near the barriers, murmuring among themselves as the Coast Guard worked with quiet precision. Divers emerged from the sea with cameras and clipboards, faces grave as they conferred with their superiors. She tried to read their expressions, searching for hints of discovery, but they remained resolutely guarded. As the sun dipped lower, the lead diver adjusted his mask and signaled to his team for another descent. Maria watched them vanish beneath the restless waves once more. She folded her arms to fight the wind's chill and forced herself not to imagine the darkness below. This wasn't a movie or a distant story, it was real. Real men risking their lives for reasons still hidden. Hours passed before any word surfaced. As the crew returned to the dock, Maria saw snippets of their findings through brief exchanges with the officials. She wasn't close enough to hear everything, but she saw the way their faces shifted from curiosity to alarm and finally to quiet urgency. Something had been found, something that demanded immediate attention. The next morning confirmed it. Workmen erected additional barriers. Signs went up warning of restricted access. Military personnel arrived with more specialized gear. Maria overheard whispers as she passed through town with Ethan. Underwater weapons, explosives, ammunition far from harmless even after decades submerged. The possibility that live ordnance lay hidden beneath the sea shook the community. Fear made people loud. Rumors spread like ripples from a thrown stone, growing wilder with each retelling. Maria did not need to guess. She knew by instinct alone that this was serious. The chain had not been merely a relic. It had been a warning. The sea had returned something the world had long forgotten, a war that never reached its end. And here she was, the ordinary woman who stumbled upon its hidden scar. A town meeting was held that evening in the modest community hall. The space was crowded, the air tense with bodies pressed shoulder to shoulder. Officials took the front, distributing sparse details. The divers had located what appeared to be a warship lying on its side 80 feet below the surface, largely intact despite its age. The vessel bore characteristics matching those used during World War II. Within the interior, they found large stores of ordnance, potentially unstable, potentially lethal. The hall filled with gasps and raised voices. Some demanded to know why this ship had never been reported. Others wanted assurances they were safe. Maria remained silent, clutching Ethan close as the officials calmly urged patience and cooperation. They promised to bring in explosive ordnance disposal experts immediately. Until then, areas near the shore would remain evacuated and fishing vessels barred from launching. When the meeting adjourned, people departed in restless clusters, muttering anxiously. Maria stayed behind a moment longer, staring at the empty podium. She wondered if anyone would acknowledge that she had found the first thread of this mystery, but she did not crave attention, only reassurance that she had done the right thing. Deep down she knew she had. Still, knowing did little to ease her fear. The island fell under a strange hush over the next days. The usual sounds of laughter from children near the docks, the chatter of fishermen comparing their catches, these softened to whispers. Even the ocean seemed to roar less defiantly, as if respecting the danger it had revealed. Maria went about her task with a knot in her stomach, watching the activity unfold from a safe distance. From her vantage point on a nearby cliff one misty morning, she saw the divers embarking on their most ambitious descent yet. Ropes fed steadily into the water as the sea swallowed them whole. The minutes stretched unbearably long, tension winding through every second. When they resurfaced, one of them brought up something that glinted faintly. The gathered soldiers leaned in close, and Maria's breath caught as she noticed the careful way they handled it, as if one wrong move could unleash disaster. Even from afar, she recognized the rounded casing, a mine aged and rusted but still recognizable. Still deadly, explosive specialists rushed in, sealing the artifact into a reinforced container with practiced urgency. Maria's spine prickled as if ice crawled beneath her skin. Her eyes drifted to Ethan, who was busy poking at shells along the beach below. How close had she allowed him to play near a graveyard of weapons? The idea that her innocent daily walks could have ended in tragedy filled her with nausea. Her thoughts spiraled. What if this intrusion into the sea disturbed something unstable? What if everything buried in that warship woke from its long sleep? The ship had survived decades in silence. Why now? Why here? Why her? When night fell, the tension did not sleep. She paced her small kitchen while Ethan snored softly in the next room, the moon casting rippling shadows across the worn floorboards. The hum of generators and engines far off by the harbor echoed through the stillness. She longed for reassurance, for someone to tell her that everything would be okay, but the world seldom offered such kindness freely. The warship's discovery dominated every conversation. Theories sprang up like weeds. Some envisioned hidden treasure locked inside its iron belly. Others feared old torpedoes primed by the shifting sands of time. Maria tried to block out the noise. She had witnessed enough truth to know that sensationalism was unnecessary. The danger was real enough without conjecture. And yet, as days bled into nights and the investigation continued, she began to feel a transformation inside herself. She had stood on that beach alone when she decided to speak out. She had sparked this effort, and now people were safer because she refused to dismiss the chain as meaningless rubble. That realization strengthened her spine. It didn't erase her fear, but it gave her purpose. The operation grew more intense. Vessels anchored permanently offshore, cranes extended over the water, and more crew arrived wearing equipment that looked like it belonged in a war zone rather than a sleepy fishing village. The scale of the mission made it clear. This was no ordinary wreck. One late afternoon, as golden light flickered across the white caps and the sounds of heavy machinery rattled through the air, Maria stood observing from behind a barricade. The lead diving supervisor spoke into a radio with an expression she could only describe as solemn. This moment felt pivotal. The crew seemed to have found something definitive. Later, she overheard a quiet conversation as a few divers stripped out of their suits. The warship's hull had been breached in several places, enough to make entry possible into the ship's lower compartments. What they saw there confirmed every worst fear. Artillery still strapped to racks as if waiting for battle. Shells lined in perfect rows untouched by time. And buried deeper still were the mines, dozens of them, heavy and volatile. The sea had hidden a sleeping monster, and now that the monster had been seen, it demanded to be dealt with. Maria returned home shaken. She read Ethan a bedtime story, lingering over every word longer than usual, as if savoring the simple comfort of an ordinary evening. Once he was asleep, she sat beside him, brushing hair away from his forehead, studying his peaceful face. She had brought him here to build a new life. She hadn't expected history itself to rise from the depths and threaten that fragile peace. She could not help but think of the men who once served aboard that warship, how they must have fought and died in terror, how their final journey ended not with memorials or homecomings, but with cold water filling their lungs and steel crushing their bones. The darkness that claimed them now brushed against her life too. Outside, the ocean whispered endlessly, never revealing whether it was friend or foe. Maria watched the moon bleed, reflections into the waves, and wondered what would surface next. She had awakened a secret, and she feared the secret was not done with her. Even as fear pressed against her chest like a physical weight, she forced herself to remember why she acted, why she chose to speak when others might have turned away. She did it for Ethan, for the child who depended on her strength even on days where she felt none. If she had remained silent, if she had ignored the chain and walked past without a second glance, then ignorance might have doomed them all. She took a deep breath and closed her eyes. The world beyond Adler Island might have forgotten the warship, but she wouldn't. She owed those long-dead sailors a kind of respect, even if only through her resolve to see this crisis through. The past had risen to the surface, and whether she liked it or not, she had become part of its story. Tomorrow would bring new dangers, new uncertainties, but Maria would meet them. Just as the tide always returned, she too would endure. Fear has a way of moving silently. It doesn't always shout or show itself like a wildfire sweeping through a forest. Sometimes it slips into a community in small breaths, in the stiff backs of people walking down the street, in doors that close just a little faster, in conversations that die the moment someone new approaches. That was how fear settled over Adler Island. It was not the fear of storms or hunger or hardship. Those were familiar companions here. This fear came from the unknown lurking beneath the sea, from something long dead that refused to stay buried. Maria noticed the change immediately. The harbor, once alive with fishermen prepping their boats before sunrise, had become eerily quiet. Engines remained cold. Nets hung untouched. Government signs warned against entering restricted areas, and those alone were enough to deter even the boldest fishermen. Some residents stayed indoors as though the danger might seep into their homes through the cracks in the walls. Conversations that once turned to weather and crab seasons were now dominated by the warship and its deadly cargo. Everyone was waiting for news, waiting for orders, waiting for something to happen. For Maria, waiting was its own torment. Her home was among those located closest to the restricted zone, and officials advised her to evacuate temporarily. They pressed a folded document into her hand, detailing the risks in careful, sterile language. Few on the island had the luxury to argue. Lives and livelihoods were at stake. Maria gathered essentials: clothes for both her and Ethan, medicine, her late husband's watch, and the single-frame photo that showed the three of them together in a happier time. She tried to pack quietly, but Ethan watched her with wide eyes, confusion mixing with fear. They were relocated to the school gymnasium, which now functioned as a makeshift shelter. Cots lined the walls and tables were converted into play areas for restless children whose parents barely had the emotional energy to keep them entertained. The noise should have been comforting, the sounds of community clinging together through uncertainty, but it only made the air feel heavier. Everyone spoke in hushed tones. Even the children seemed subdued, sensing the tension that adults failed to hide. Ethan clung to Maria's side. He understood little about warships or explosives, but he understood that adults were afraid, and that was enough to unsettle him. Maria held him close, smoothing his hair as he leaned into her. She wished she could tell him everything was fine, that they were safe and that nothing bad would happen, but the words caught in her throat. Children deserve truth softened into comfort, but this truth came wrapped in too many unknowns for her to promise any outcome. The media arrived soon after the evacuations began. Journalists from Anchorage and even Seattle disembarked with cameras and microphones, searching for dramatic angles. They filmed the barriers, recorded the divers in their gear, interviewed commanders in uniform. Headlines were already forming. Sunken warship threatens coastal town, or Pacific relic holds lethal secret. Maria tried to stay out of their view. She didn't want Ethan's face in the background of someone's panic-filled broadcast, so she kept to corners, shielding him from curious lenses while listening to the snippets of information she could gather. Despite her avoidance, she couldn't help but feel invisible. Nobody seemed to know or care that she was the one who found the chain. She had been the first thread pulled on this unraveling mystery. Yet no reporter asked for her name or how she discovered it. There was no mention of a vigilant mother who alerted the authorities before danger struck. Her silence had safeguarded the town before anyone else knew there was something to fear. But recognition was a luxury she didn't expect. She had grown accustomed to the world overlooking her. Still, a quiet ache nestled inside her chest. Days blurred together. Each morning brought updates delivered by stern-faced officials to worried citizens. They spoke of ongoing danger and the delicate operation underway. Nothing was certain yet. Explosive disposal teams were flown in, men and women in specialized suits. Their equipment marked with bright warnings and technical jargon Maria couldn't decipher. They were trained to face what others would flee from, and they approached their work with a solemn focus that left no room for error. Maria found herself standing at a window often, holding Ethan's hand tightly while she watched trucks rumble toward the shore. She imagined what was happening just beyond her sight. Divers navigating the ship's torn skeleton, the shifting currents tugging at them like ghostly hands. Underwater drones weaving through dark corridors where the remains of wartime urgency lay untouched for decades. A single wrong movement could trigger catastrophe. The enormity of that responsibility weighed heavily on everyone. Each night, the shelter lights flickered off row by row, leaving only shadows. Ethan would curl against Maria, asking when they could go home. Maria wished she could say soon, but the truth was that she didn't know. Instead, she kissed the top of his head and whispered stories of brave explorers and magical islands where danger was conquered by courage. Her voice was steady, but her heart trembled. Outside the gym, many residents lingered around fires built in metal barrels. The flames cast wavering light over anxious faces. Among them were old men who remembered stories from their fathers about wartime ships slipping through these waters, missions cloaked in secrecy, vessels that never returned. They spoke not loudly but with reverence, as though acknowledging those who had been swallowed by the sea. Maria listened from a distance, holding Ethan's hand. The tales made her think more deeply about the sailors entombed below. Their lives had been marked by sacrifice, yet history forgot them. Now, after so many years, their final battleground was once again a place of danger. It saddened her to imagine mothers like herself, who had waited for news that never came. The morning after a particularly restless night, Maria woke to the sound of helicopters thundering overhead. The vibration rattled the walls and sent a murmur through the shelter. People rushed to the doors and windows. Maria followed, her heart pounding. Through the foggy glass, she saw two Chinooks flying low over the water, carrying large containers slung beneath them. Something critical was happening. She stepped outside into the frigid morning air. Workers on the ground signaled to the aircraft as they hovered near the shore. The containers were lowered onto waiting platforms, and teams rushed forward with practiced efficiency. Maria squinted hard, trying to understand what she was seeing. Her breath caught when one of the containers was unlatched. Out of it, carefully shielded and surrounded by detonators and protective harnesses, came one of the underwater mines. Even corroded and marked with age, the mine radiated menace. Its shape was unmistakable, a relic of violence that still possessed the power to destroy. In that moment, Maria felt as though the war had returned in full force to claim new lives. Her stomach tightened painfully, and she pulled Ethan close, telling him to look away. But still, he peaked with the innocent fascination children have when faced with things they don't fully understand. More mines followed, each handled like a coiled serpent ready to strike. They were loaded onto armored trucks and taken to a secured location at the opposite end of the island, where experts would attempt to neutralize them. Maria watched every movement as if the safety of the entire island rested on her vigilance. She couldn't shake the irrational belief that if she looked away, something terrible would happen. By afternoon, rumors spread faster than facts. Some residents believed the warship held chemical weapons. Others whispered about classified technology. Fear made imaginations wild. For Maria, fear sharpened into clarity. There was no room for mistakes. Lives depended on precision, caution, and unwavering attention. Later that evening, the residents were called to another meeting. Officials stood before a restless crowd in the gymnasium, outlining the escalating situation. The warship was identified as a vessel lost during a fierce battle in the Northern Pacific. Its disappearance had been recorded, but never fully explained. Now its discovery threatened the island because its ammunition remained unstable. The officials assured everyone that the best experts were on site, working to prevent disaster. They urged the public to stay calm. Calm was a luxury no one in that room possessed. Maria listened carefully to every word, her hand gripping Ethan's shoulder. She sensed the carefully chosen phrases carried assurances, masking urgency. Still, she appreciated their attempts to protect those who could do nothing but wait. As the crowd dispersed, the dim glow of emergency lights guided residents back toward their cots. Maria and Ethan paused outside the gym for a moment to breathe fresh air. The night sky, usually so clear here, was clouded by haze and the faint smoke rising from security camps near the shore. The stars looked blurred and distant, as though fear itself had smudged the sky. Maria lifted Ethan into her arms, holding him tightly. He pressed his cheek against her, small hands clutching her coat. She wished she could be as strong as she felt he needed her to be. The weight of uncertainty pressed hard against her chest, but with Ethan clasped to her, she found enough courage to stand tall. When she returned inside, she tucked him into a cot near the wall, covering him with familiar blankets they had brought from home. He fell asleep quickly, exhaustion conquering fear. Maria sat on the edge of her own cot, staring into the muted glow of a battery-powered lamp. Around her, the soft sound of restless sleepers filled the gym. It sounded like a place caught between nerves and hope, not quite broken, but trembling at the edges. Her thoughts drifted again to the sailors entombed in the warship's darkness. She imagined young men with lives and dreams of families waiting for them. Lives now reduced to artifacts and ordnance that imperiled a small town decades later. How could something so old still hold so much danger? How could a past conflict reach forward in time and choke the present? Silence draped over the gym as Maria closed her eyes, exhaustion tugging at her. But before sleep could pull her under, a realization rose in her chest. This wasn't just history resurfacing. This wasn't just a relic of war. The chain she had discovered, the one she had almost walked past, was not only an anchor to a ship on the ocean floor, but a link connecting her life to those lost anchors of history. She felt an inexplicable bond to the events unfolding. She had drawn the first breath of attention toward a secret that might have slept forever. Whether this made her brave or simply unlucky, she didn't know. What she did know was that she couldn't succumb to fear. Ethan needed her. The town needed her quiet resolve. And somewhere deep inside, she felt that acknowledging these dangers, facing them head-on, was a form of respect to the men who never returned home. Maria lay down and pulled the blanket to her chin. The ocean roared in the distance, a restless giant guarding its secrets. Tomorrow would come, bringing new challenges and perhaps new threats. But she was determined to face it. The past had risen from the depths, demanding to be reckoned with. And though she was only one woman, one mother trying to keep her child safe, she would not shrink from what was coming. Sleep was never deep in the school gymnasium. Even in the quietest hours, someone always shifted on a creaking cot. A child whimpered in their dreams, or a door groaned as officials came and went through the night. Maria had learned to rest in small pieces, moments where exhaustion forced her eyes closed even if her mind refused calm. When morning crept in through narrow high windows, casting pale rectangles of light onto the glossy floor, she woke already alert, the weight of responsibility pressing against her chest before she had even sat up. Ethan was still curled beneath his blanket, breathing softly. His dark hair fell across his forehead, making him look even younger than he was. Maria brushed it aside gently and smiled at the comfort of that tiny act. But the peace tugged at her heart with equal force, because peace felt borrowed here, fragile and poised to vanish without warning. She rose quietly, stretching stiff muscles, and walked toward the gym's entrance. She could already hear the distant hum of machinery from the shoreline, a constant reminder that danger had rooted itself firmly into their island. The ocean, once a symbol of space and possibility, had become a guardian of violence. It held the warship locked in its cold grip, and now with each passing day, more of that vessel's deadly secrets were being drawn to the surface. Maria wrapped her arms around herself and stepped outside into the crisp morning air. Fog clung low over the land, as if the sky itself was waiting to see what would remain when the mystery was resolved. Officials moved briskly along the road, directing trucks and personnel. She noted their tense expressions, the hurried but measured movements. Something had changed. She sensed it immediately, an intuition born of days observing the rhythm of this operation. Today would not be like the others. Today would bring resolution one way or another. Residents milled about outside the gym, huddling in small clusters, trying to read the signs in the air. Many looked worn, their nerves frayed by uncertainty. The evacuation had upended their lives, stealing the illusion of safety that usually shielded them from the harshness of reality. Maria exchanged a few polite words and nods as she passed, keeping Ethan close once he awakened and joined her outside. Although life on Adler Island was often unforgiving, the community here was deeply interconnected, and shared fear had only strengthened those ties. Then as sunlight began to slice through the fog, the announcement came. A representative from the Coast Guard, dressed in dark uniform with bright badges that gleamed, called everyone together. People gathered in a loose semicircle, anxious for news. Maria lifted Ethan onto her hip so he could see above the crowd. The officer's voice carried authority and a layer of reassurance, though Maria could detect the careful crafting behind every sentence. The worst had been avoided. The majority of the explosives had been safely removed from the warship and transported for controlled neutralization. The risk of detonation remained low now. The island was no longer in imminent danger. A hush fell over the crowd for a heartbeat, then a wave of relief crashed through them, with sighs, muttered prayers, even a few tears. Some clapped, others embraced. Maria felt her shoulders suddenly lighter, as though the tight band of fear that had wrapped around her ribs for days had finally begun to loosen. She closed her eyes briefly, holding Ethan a little tighter. But the officer wasn't finished. Though the situation had improved, operations would continue over the next weeks to ensure no lingering hazards remained. Only a portion of residents, including those closest to the affected zone, were allowed to return home immediately. Maria's address was among them. Names were read from a list, and when she heard her own, shock rippled through her chest. She had expected to wait longer. She had expected the danger to cling to her life the way worry always did. Yet here she was, granted permission to step back into the house she had feared she might lose forever. Ethan cheered beside her, excitement bursting from him like the sunlight that now streamed fully through the thinning fog. Maria kissed his cheek, unable to stop herself from smiling. Officials escorted the returning residents in small groups. Maria and Ethan walked the familiar path toward their home, though it felt unfamiliar now after days spent in the shelter. The road past the beach, still too heavily restricted to approach, but she saw enough. Machinery remained stationed there, and divers prepared for yet another plunge. Banners and warning signs still proclaimed caution. The warship's presence wasn't gone, just contained. When they reached the small weathered house, Maria paused before unlocking the door. It was exactly as they had left it. The chipped paint on the frame, the rattling windows that struggled against the wind, the porch where Ethan once stacked stones into imaginary castles. But now this aging home looked like a sanctuary instead of a liability. She pushed the door open, and the familiar scent of their life welcomed them, the faint aroma of soap and old wood, blankets waiting on the couch, the kitchen where she had taught Ethan how to shape dough into clumsy cookies. Tears pricked her eyes, though she refused to let them fall. She had cried too many times over loss. Crying from relief felt impossibly strange. Inside, they set their things down and exhaled deeply. The silence was comforting rather than tense. The house had waited, strong enough to endure what might have happened. Maria made breakfast with trembling hands, not because she felt weak, but because this ordinary act felt miraculous. Ethan chattered nonstop, running from room to room as though rediscovering forgotten treasure. She let him explore, knowing he needed this moment of joy to reclaim his sense of safety. She stood at the window while the eggs cooked, watching the ocean beyond the hills. For the first time since she found the chain, she allowed herself to believe that they might truly build a life here. Not a temporary refuge, but a real home. As she stared out at the horizon, she thought of Michael. This was the kind of moment she had once wished he could share. Ethan's laughter, sunlight on the waves, hope blooming where despair had once taken root. She whispered a silent message to the man she had loved so deeply. Perhaps the wind would carry it to wherever his soul now rested. Later that afternoon, after giving residents some time to settle, military representatives visited Maria's home. 2 officers in uniform approached cautiously, though with purpose. She invited them inside, offering the politeness she had always shown visitors, even when her nerves tensed like stretched wire. Ethan retreated to his room, playing with his battered toy fire truck. One of the officers, a woman with steady eyes, explained that Maria's discovery had played a key role in averting disaster. She and her son might not have fully understood what her call meant at the time, but it had provided a critical early warning. Without her intervention, fishermen might have accidentally dredged up explosives. A passing ship might have anchored too close. A natural shift in the sea floor might have set off a catastrophic chain reaction. Maria tried to remain composed as the woman continued, expressing gratitude on behalf of the Coast Guard and other military branches involved. She spoke of commendations, financial support allocated for those whose actions protected national security. Words like recognition and compensation floated through the air, as though this modest kitchen was the setting of something grand. Maria listened, humbled and stunned. She wanted to say she only did what anyone else would have done, but deep down she knew that wasn't always true. People overlooked things every day, ignored instincts, avoided inconvenience. If she had walked away that morning on the beach, the course of events might have been drastically different, and that truth settled into her with both pride and disbelief. The officer handed her an official document explaining what types of support she would receive. A stipend to help them stabilize financially, access to stable employment opportunities with benefits, perhaps even a role assisting with shoreline monitoring and island safety efforts. Jobs that needed someone observant and attentive, someone willing to step forward when others hesitated. Maria glanced at Ethan, who peeked around the doorway, curiosity shining in his eyes. Steady income, security, purpose. These were dreams she had hardly dared to form, yet here they were, unfolding in her own living room. When the officers left, promising to return later with more details, Maria sank into a chair. Her hands covered her face, overwhelmed by the magnitude of the moment. She had spent so long struggling to keep them afloat that this sudden shift felt unreal. It wasn't fortune or blind luck. It was the world finally recognizing her effort, her vigilance, her unspoken strength. Ethan climbed onto her lap, small arms wrapping tightly around her. She held him close, pressing her cheek to his soft hair. They sat there together, mother and son, surrounded by familiar walls in a home reclaimed from fear. She whispered into his ear that everything would get better from now on. Things would change. They would not always live with uncertainty clawing at their door. He smiled, accepting her words with the unquestioning faith children possess, and that faith fed her own. Days turned into a quiet rhythm again. But nothing was quite the same. Maria remained cautious. She knew the operation was not fully over, yet she no longer woke with dread. She welcomed officials who stopped by to ask about local geography or confirm details regarding her discovery. Her voice no longer trembled when she spoke. She had become someone different without even realizing the moment of change. A woman shaped by adversity but not broken by it. The warship did not disappear. Crews continued working offshore, retrieving pieces of the past and neutralizing danger, respecting the graves of the long-departed soldiers. Maria watched from afar, often holding Ethan's hand, thinking of lives lost and remembered. She wondered if the sailors' spirits took comfort knowing their final resting place now held gratitude instead of silence. With every retrieved mine, with every careful extraction, the past was acknowledged, not erased, but laid more gently in history's pages. One evening, after a day filled with modest but satisfying chores, washing clothes, sweeping floors that always seemed to collect sand, cooking a small but hearty meal, Maria and Ethan walked together to the beach. The area closest to the wreck remained sealed, but a stretch further along the coast was open. The tide was low, revealing flattened stones and shimmering pools where tiny fish darted in liquid caves. The golden hue of sunset draped the island in warmth. For the first time, Maria didn't think about danger or warnings or fear. She thought about possibility. Ethan skipped ahead, searching for shells with gleeful eyes. Maria paused near the water's edge, listening to the soft murmur of waves. She could just glimpse the faint silhouettes of ships stationed near the horizon, working as guardians that kept history from inflicting more wounds. She allowed herself a moment of reflection. She remembered the morning she had seen that strange curve of metal in the gravel, the way her breath had caught, the way the chain refused to move with the tide. What if she had hesitated? What if she had chosen to believe it was nothing? In those alternate versions of reality, she saw the fragile world she now cherished slipping into ash and ruin. Discovery had prevented disaster, but it had also given her something unexpected, a renewed sense of self. Her past had been defined by loss. The death of her husband had shattered her sense of direction, leaving her adrift in grief. Everything afterward had felt like a desperate attempt to keep from drowning, but now she wasn't just surviving. She had interrupted devastation, saved lives, protected a community. The chain linked her not only to danger, but to purpose. It had borne the weight of a ship, but also the weight of a new beginning. Maria tilted her head toward the horizon. Somewhere beneath those waves lay the final testament of men who had once fought for a better world, sacrificing futures they never got to live. She honored them silently. Their war had not been in vain if its remnants could awaken courage in those who came after. If their presence beneath the sea had brought her clarity, strength, and a second chance, then perhaps that was a legacy greater than any forgotten battle. The tide lapped at her boots, bringing with it a cool touch that felt both grounding and cleansing. She smiled as Ethan returned to her, his hands full of mismatched seashells he proudly displayed like ancient artifacts. She knelt down, admiring them with sincere delight, even though they were ordinary. Ordinary was beautiful now. Ordinary was everything she had fought for. As they walked home, the last glimmers of sunlight fading behind them, Maria felt lighter than she had in years. The wind no longer howled as though daring her to endure. Instead, it carried whispers of opportunity. She took one last look at the sea before turning away, not out of fear, but out of acceptance. The ocean would always hold its mysteries, its tragedies, its lost souls. But it had also become a quiet partner in her story, a reminder that life could be unpredictable and cruel, yet still capable of delivering redemption when least expected. Inside their home, she helped Ethan wash up for bed. He fell asleep quickly, arms wrapped around his favorite blanket. Maria lingered by the window, watching the moon's reflection tremble across the surface of the water. She thought not of fear, but of gratitude. The world had pulled her through many storms, tested her strength relentlessly. But here she stood, not only surviving, but moving forward. Tomorrow she would meet with officials again to finalize arrangements for her new job. She would ensure Ethan's future was secure. She would allow herself to dream again, and she would do it with the knowledge that even in a place as remote and harsh as Adler Island, Hope could rise like the sun through fog, quiet, steady, unstoppable. Maria turned away from the window, letting the curtain fall. She crawled into bed, letting the warmth of blankets wrap around her like a promise. Outside, the sea continued its eternal rhythm, whispering over stones and secrets. It no longer sounded ominous. It sounded like life continuing. History had risen from the depths, but Maria had risen too. The ocean had returned something devastating, but in doing so, it had given her back her strength. The past no longer held her by the ankles, threatening to drag her down. She faced the future with emotion, but not fear, with remembrance, but not regret. In the gentle quiet of her home, Maria closed her eyes and breathed deeply. This was her island now, her life, her second chance. And she would hold on to it with the same fierce determination that once drove her to uncover the rusted chain half buried in the gravel, a discovery that had changed everything. If this story kept you on the edge of your seat, make sure to subscribe right now so you don't miss the next shocking twist. Click the bell and be the first to see what happens in our upcoming videos. Share this story with your friends and family. You never know who might uncover a hidden truth next. And tell us in the comments, where are you watching from?